Welcome to the Holy Post. Donald Trump has launched a global trade war because he thinks America's trade deficit makes us losers. But does he even understand what a trade deficit is? Then Phil introduces a new segment full of statistics that make me and Kaitlyn groan, and we discuss David Brooks' new article in The Atlantic, which compares this moment in history to the era of Andrew Jackson, and he offers hope for what might be coming after MAGA. And I interview Jonathan Rauch about his new book, Cross Purposes. Rauch, who's an atheist, says his antagonism toward Christianity changed when he came to see how vital it is to American democracy, and why evangelicals' failure to follow Jesus is now putting the whole country at risk. Before we get started today, big news: tickets for our next Holy Post event are now available. I'm going to be in Detroit, Michigan on Saturday, March 3rd, and my guest will be award-winning journalist and author Tim Alberta. He's one of my favorite reporters today, and his book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism, was one of my absolute favorite reads from last year. You do not want to miss this event, where you can interact with me and Tim about what's going on in both Washington and the church today. Head over to holypost.com/events to get your tickets today. That's holypost.com/events. Here is episode 664.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. This is Phil Vischer. I'm here with Kaitlyn Skye. Hi, Kaitlyn Skye.
Hi, Phil Vischer.
Hi. And Skye Jitani.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Skye. Skye has a hat. Tell us about your hat, Skye.
I have a hat. It says, "That's bonkers" on it.
Oh, That's Bonkers
Whoa.
hat.
It's a beanie, a knit
From
cap.
the show That's Bonkers.
Yeah, okay. This comes from Krista Kim, whose whole family listens from Southern California.
Okay.
She said, "I enjoy the content you make and your perspective on Holy Post. As a fellow Gen Xer, every time you say 'that's bonkers,' I almost spit laugh. If I did a word of the year, it would be bonkers for 2025. So I thought this was great because I guess I do say that's bonkers a lot. I didn't really,
It hadn't occurred to me. Maybe I'm
now
just
we're
used
gonna
to
notice it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, drinking game. Every time Skye says that's bonkers, you have some milk.
Or some tea. How about some tea? All right. So the hat is going on the glass head.
Nice.
On to the head of glass.
Krista, thank you very much for the bonkers hat.
Goes the bonkers hat. Thank you for the bonkers hat. Have we got any more pink stuff for Kaitlyn, or did that just run its course?
Thank you for saying something, Phil.
Yeah.
We need to remind people.
Yeah, where's
to
the pink
send
stuff for
things
Kaitlyn?
to me.
Yeah, Kaitlyn wants pink stuff. Anything. Pink anything.
Anything pink.
Like a full-scale Barbie dollhouse in pink.
Oh my gosh. I would love if someone sent a Barbie dollhouse. Are you kidding?
Okay.
And what about you, Phil? You don't get anything.
No, I don't get anything.
We've talked about
I
this.
just try
He's
to get
grumpy.
out of here alive. That's my goal.
Okay.
Is get out alive before they catch me. And now it's time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Kaitlyn. The Holy Post is sponsored by BetterHelp. We are living in crazy times, and that can be hard on your mental health. Plus, relationship stress, parenting, marriage, and work stress, it all adds up. Well, don't try to handle all this on your own. You can get help from trained professionals. But the economy and tariffs and the price of eggs, adding therapy onto all that feels like a huge investment, and the cost of traditional in-person therapy can be huge, costing anywhere from $100 to $250 per session. Online therapy with BetterHelp can save you, on average, up to 50% for each session. BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served more than 5 million people around the world. It's easy, too. You can join a session with the click of a button to help fit therapy into your busy life. And you can switch therapists at any time. You can do better than just survive these crazy times. Your well-being is worth it. Visit BetterHelp.com/HolyPost today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/HolyPost. Today's episode is sponsored by Blueland. Did you know we throw away an estimated 5 billion plastic hand soap and cleaning product bottles every year? And lots of that plastic ends up in our water supply, so that each of us are eating roughly a credit card's worth of plastic each week. Yuck! I don't want to eat plastic. Blueland is on a mission to eliminate single-use plastic. Their idea is simple. They offer endlessly refillable cleaning products with a beautiful design that looks great on your counter. Just fill the bottles with water, drop in Blueland tablets, and wait for them to dissolve. You'll never ever have to buy giant bottles of cleaning supplies again. From cleaning sprays to hand soap, toilet bowl cleaner, and laundry tablets, all Blueland products are made with clean ingredients you can feel good about. And Blueland has an offer just for Holy Post listeners. Get 15% off your first purchase of any product. To get 15% off your first order, go to blueland.com/holypost. You won't want to miss this. Blueland.com/holypost. That's blueland.com/holypost. And thanks to Blueland for sponsoring this episode. Interesting week.
Uh-huh.
I was in St. Louis over the weekend and was on a panel at Washington University that I actually agreed to do 2 years ago before my wife got sick, and then I had to cancel last year because my wife got sick, and then I said I'll do it again this year, so I did it this year. But there were quite a few people there that came up and said, "Hey, love the podcast. Hey, love the podcast." And I never know when I'm going somewhere Christian-y if it's going to be a line of people who want to hear VeggieTales voices, but it's shifting so that it's more people about the podcast now than about the thing that I did 30 years ago, which is nice.
That happens.
I like that.
That is nice.
I like that. It makes me feel like I'm still living.
And relevant.
You're very much still living.
Well, thank you, Kaitlyn.
I can confirm.
Thank you for noticing.
You are alive.
Because I'm attempting to keep moving and to give the impression, The Illusion of Life, which is the best book on animation ever written.
Have you seen that new Bob Dylan movie, Complete Unknown? I just watched it last night, and one of his things is they always want him to play his biggest, and he never wants to. He always wants to do the new thing, and people don't want the new thing; they want the old thing. So the fact that people are speaking to you about your new thing, that's really good.
That is really good.
I'm living Bob Dylan's dream.
Right.
That in mind, given the week we've had, I've come up with a new segment.
Oh, no.
And I'm hoping we don't have to do this for very long.
But you're already announcing it as a reoccurring segment.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes me worried.
Because it's not going away anytime soon, I'm afraid. The new segment is entitled, Terrible Things America is Doing to the World This Week. Hey, everybody.
Do we have to?
Don't know if you noticed, but the stock market's crashing. Did you notice that?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I bumped into an older friend, a retired friend this morning at my coffee shop who'd made the mistake of looking at her 401k over the weekend. She was not happy. According to some analysts, the odds are now past 60% that the U.S. is headed into a recession. Why, you ask? Well, because we decided to start a trade war with the entire world.
Can that we again, Phil? It's a little too broad.
We Americans got together and decided to start a trade war with the whole. We're putting. You all have heard this, but you haven't heard our perspective. So I thought you might want to hear our perspective because I know that Kaitlyn, when she's not working on her dissertation, her doctorate, her whatever it is thinking about international trade. And
you got me.
Has a point of view. So we put heavy tariffs on China, which is something that people have talked about a lot because, we have a huge trade imbalance and they're not always fair with their pricing and their currency manipulation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we put an even bigger tariff on the tiny African kingdom of Lesotho. Bigger than on China.
No, they deserve it. They had it coming.
Lesotho, almost 50% tariff on Lesotho.
Oh my gosh.
Now, why do you think that is, Skye? Are they an existential threat to the U.S. economy? It's one of the poorest countries in Africa, by the way, Lesotho.
My understanding is that these trade tariffs were calculated based on trade imbalances, not necessarily reciprocal tariffs, even though that's how they were titled. So I'm guessing there's some kind of weird trade imbalance with Lesotho.
Lesotho buys almost nothing from America.
I don't think they buy much of anything from anywhere.
No, they don't. They do export diamonds and textiles. And there's been a move over the last 20 years or so of moving some textile work, like Levi's jeans, for example. Some of your Levi's might be made in Lesotho. So it's helping them rise out of poverty. But
Kaitlyn's exasperated.
now we want to push them back down because we resent the fact that we give them more money than they give us. And interestingly, so many, I'm sorry I have to keep bringing this up, but I'm not terribly happy about what's going on. Maybe you're happy. I don't know. I won't hold it against you. If you're happy, I'm not happy about what's going on. Donald Trump actually revealed on Air Force One yesterday or the day before, he took the weekend off to golf, to play in a golf tournament, which he claims he won.
He wins all of them.
I know. He wins every golf tournament he plays in. But on Air Force One on the way back, he started talking about tariffs and said the problem is that we have trade deficits with almost every country in the world.
That's because we're the wealthiest country in the world.
Yes.
That's how that works.
And we're a post-industrial country. So much of our economy is in services now,
Right.
not in durable goods.
Right.
He said, we have to tariff countries until we no longer have trade deficits with them.
Right.
Like that is what he was looking for. We want tariffs on China. We have about $1 trillion trade deficit with China. It's just like monstrously huge because they're the world's factory and have been for the last 30 years. So we're going to tariff them until we have no trade deficit with China.
Tariff them.
It's terrifying.
Tariff them.
Just tariff them.
They're teraphim and cherubim in the Bible.
That's what I've heard.
And we're going to do that with Lesotho. We're going to tariff you until you're buying as much in Teslas and soybeans as we're buying in diamonds and Levi's from you, which of course is never going to happen.
Right. I know many people smarter than me and who have economic backgrounds are talking about this all over the media, but it's just so incandescently stupid. The basic failure to understand how trade works, which is like, if I go to Chick-fil-A, I don't know how many times a year I or my family goes to Chick-fil-A, but let's say, I don't know, let's just take a random number. Let's say I spend $1,000 a year on Chick-fil-A.
Low.
Is that low?
I think so.
Okay, I don't know what it is.
I haven't gone to Chick-fil-A in the last 2 years.
Okay, just for simplicity's sake, let's say my family spends $1,000 at Chick-fil-A this year. The fact that Chick-fil-A does not buy anything from me
but
means there's a trade imbalance. Now let's complicate things.
Chick-fil-A is a restaurant.
I know, but let's complicate. They're still not paying me anything.
They're a restaurant.
Okay.
It's not another person that you have an imbalance.
Then let's personalize it.
Okay.
Let's say the manager of the Chick-fil-A or the owner of the Chick-fil-A franchise in Wheaton here, I don't know who that is, but let's say I go to his restaurant, only his restaurant, and I pay $1,000 this year for food from his restaurant. And he turns around and says, you know what, Skye, you are such a loyal, wonderful customer. I am going to subscribe to With God Daily, your daily devotional. And I don't know why, but I'm going to pay you $1,000 this year for that devotional.
Ooh.
According to Trump's logic, we would still have a trade imbalance because I got physical chicken from him, but he only got digital words from me.
He got a service.
He got a service.
Worthless.
Not a good.
So it doesn't count, which means I would have to tariff him on, I don't know what he's possibly going to buy for me that's an actual physical good. But that's not how trade works.
Well, and there are always going to be trade deficits if you're a wealthy country.
Right.
Dealing with less wealthy countries because of the way that capital in manufacturing in particular pursues lower cost manufacturing because it's what wealthy countries like,
right,
is more stuff for less money.
It's also true between larger countries population-wise and smaller countries.
Yeah, hence Canada,
exactly.
our sworn nemesis.
They have one-tenth the population of the United States, so they're never going to buy as much stuff from us as we are going to buy from them because we have a lot more people to buy Canadian stuff than they have Canadians to buy American stuff. That's just normal.
But Trump actually said out loud on Air Force One, he revealed his ethical code. He said, I consider deficits losing. He said that out loud. So he wants all countries to have either break even, That's okay. Or we have a trade surplus, which means we're winning. So we need to be winning, not Lesotho and not, South Korea. Think about how many Samsung and LG appliances we all have and phones and everything else Samsung and LG makes. And then think about all the Kia and Hyundais.
You know what LG stands for?
Well, it was Gold Star.
Lucky Gold Star.
Yeah.
What?
It was Gold Star before.
But then it became Lucky Gold Star.
I didn't know about the Lucky.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the Lucky. Huh. Yeah, because Gold Star electronics, when I was a kid, were real cheap. It was like, oh, that's all you could afford was a Gold Star. So the rebrand was great. It was like, oh, there's a whole new company called LG. I wonder what that is. And now, so no TVs are made in the US. Mm-hmm. So all TVs are getting more expensive. And it's very unlikely we're going to start. And here's, okay, just in speaking in terms of economics, Kaitlyn, yeah, what do you want to say, Kaitlyn?
Oh, no, you go ahead.
Okay. Companies do not invest in the face of uncertainty. Companies want certainty before they invest. Trump's policies are so mercurial that you would be a fool to put $500 million into a new U.S. manufacturing plant because of the tariffs that he may change his mind about next week.
Yeah.
Kaitlyn, what do you think?
I am not an expert on economics, so I'm not going to really comment on the mechanics of this. I do think, as I was listening to you both talking, I was thinking about, I taught in Bible study at my church a few weeks ago. We've been doing this series on Elijah, the prophet. And I was teaching on the showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, which most people learn this story as like a kid in Sunday school because it's such a good story where, Elijah is supposed to be purifying God's people, getting them to turn from idolatry to true worship of God. And so he basically just challenges the prophets of Baal. They'll both put up altars and see which god provides the fire to make these sacrifices on these altars. And the prophets of Baal set up their altar. Elijah sets up his altar. And then the prophets of Baal do all this stuff to try and get Baal to light the altar. They go around yelling and cutting themselves and dancing, and they do all this ridiculous stuff. And Elijah at one point starts just making fun of them, being like, yell louder. Maybe Baal is sleeping. Maybe he's gone on a trip. Maybe you need to do some more things to get him to come and do this.
Maybe he's in the bathroom. You forgot the best part.
Maybe he's in the bathroom.
Yeah, that's every middle school boy's favorite Bible story.
It's a great mock.
Maybe he is relieving himself.
So, and then of course it doesn't happen. And then Elijah waters the altar to make it harder for it to catch on fire and beseeches God, and God lights the whole thing, goes beyond, above and beyond. And lights
I'm really interested on how you apply this to tariffs.
Mm-hmm. Just wait. Okay. So I'm thinking about this while y'all are talking, because you're talking about how in pursuit of power and this illusion of winning, people are willing to do things that just seem patently absurd and self-destructive for their supposed goals. And I keep thinking about this story because when I was teaching to the women in my Bible study, I was saying, we think this looks ridiculous. The prophets of Baal are doing things that just look ridiculous. They're cutting themselves, they're yelling, they're dancing. And it's obvious to anyone reading the story, this idol cannot do anything. This idol cannot save you. You're just looking silly for no reason. And I was telling them, this looks ridiculous to us, but this is how idols work. You end up serving something that will ask things of you that not only make you look ridiculous, but that are self-destructive. You end up doing things you would have sworn you would never do. And as I'm hearing this, I don't know much about the mechanics of international trade and global economics, but I do know what it looks like from the outside, which is that people serving the idol of just sheer power and winning are being asked by that idol to do things that are patently self-destructive to the country and their own interests, and that make them look silly. And I think it's important to just name that those are some of the spiritual dynamics going on. It's always happening in politics, and it seems like this is a pretty vibrant example of it.
Interesting.
Sometimes we should be looking for the underlying logic. Sometimes we can just say people are worshiping idols, and idols ask you to do things that are self-destructive and silly.
Okay, I think that's a fantastic metaphor, but it's missing one component, a real dark.
Of course you think so.
No, a real dark component. And that is, if all that was happening is Trump or his administration were looking really ridiculous and silly, we'd be like, okay, they're ridiculous and silly.
It harms people.
It harms real people. So
yes,
the better metaphor,
which is what idols do too.
Right. The better metaphor might be if those prophets of Baal started sacrificing innocent people or sacrificing children. right? Which they did. So like when you start victimizing other people in this for the pursuit of your idol, I mean, very innocent people are going to be devastated. You mentioned poorer countries in Africa or elsewhere, but many Americans are going to not just lose their 401k, but lose their jobs, their well-being. Factories are going to close. All kinds of things, if this continues, is going to have devastating effects on the most vulnerable people. And that's awful.
And I think it's important that sometimes it works in a way that seems self-interested. Like sometimes the mechanics of the world really do work where it's like, I'll sacrifice these vulnerable people, but I get something out of it. What I appreciate about this story in scripture is that it points out that at the end of the day, even if it seems to momentarily benefit you, it ultimately doesn't. Like it still hurts you. It still destroys you. You still look silly. And it was never worth it to sacrifice the vulnerable people to get whatever you thought you were getting out of it. But you don't even get what you think you got out of it. You end up being hurt too.
Right.
Okay. I'm not done with my segment yet, but it's all along a theme. Of things we did last week, state education officials will be required to verify that they have eliminated all programs that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the Trump administration will withhold federal funding from public schools. A memo sent to top public education officials across the country. The education department said that funding for schools with high percentages of low-income students, known as Title I funding, was at risk pending compliance with the new directive that they must sign a letter and return the letter to the department within 10 days that they have eliminated all programs that the administration claims unfairly promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, otherwise known as the evil DEI.
I thought he was shutting down the Department of Education. So how does that work?
They have to do all this stuff to control what people are teaching first, and then they can shut it all down so that the federal government doesn't control what people are teaching. But first they have to control what people are teaching because, quote, unquote, air quotes, improper ideology is the new term being thrown around, which they found in the Smithsonian. They've found all over the place.
This feels very McCarthyite.
No, it doesn't. Not at all. I don't know what you're talking about. Trump administration ends funding, also last week. Trump administration ends funding for legal representation for 26,000 migrant children. So unaccompanied minors that have come to the U.S., nearly 26,000 were supplied with some legal counsel. That's been cut. So now...
Are they supposed to represent themselves in court?
Yes.
As children.
Many of these children do not read or speak in English, and some are too young to read or speak at all. And the administration's decision to end these services undermines due process, disproportionately impacts vulnerable children, and puts children who have already experienced severe trauma at risk for further irreparable harm or exploitation. One of the groups that supplied those juvenile immigration services said there's a higher likelihood that they will fall into human trafficking and child trafficking if they don't have a representative looking out for them.
And what was the administration's rationale for cutting?
They don't have to have a rationale. It's probably woke or DEI, or they can deport them faster. If they don't have anyone helping them show up in court, it's easier to deport them faster. 10 million Christians in the U.S. are at risk of mass deportation. A joint project of the National Association of Evangelicals, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the Center for the Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and World Relief found many of those vulnerable to deportation themselves are Christians. Christians account for approximately 80% of all of those at risk of deportation. The Christians most at risk of deportation are Catholics. 61% of the total at risk for deportation are Catholics. At the same time, about 7 million Christians who are U.S. citizens live in the same household as someone at risk of deportation. Overall, the report found about 1 out of every 12 Christians in the U.S., including 1 out of every 18 evangelicals and about 1 out of every 5 Catholics, are either vulnerable to deportation or could see a family member deported. Okay, that's cool, because that's what Jesus said about the least of these. And people say, when he was talking about the least of these, he was only talking about Christians. So don't use that to say we need to care about people that aren't Christians. Gotcha. They're Christians.
You got the rest of the Bible to tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Phil.
Yeah.
I don't like this segment.
Yeah, me neither.
Neither do I, Skye, but we're not going to ignore what's happening.
I understand.
They did. Am I correct, though, that the funding for the legal aid for immigrant children, I think there was a federal judge that blocked that change.
There have been federal judges that have tried to block all sorts of things, but it doesn't mean they're getting refunded. That's the problem.
Yeah.
The administration doesn't
This is one of the big things that everyone's waiting for. The big crisis is if and when the Supreme Court rules against this administration and the president decides, who cares?
To not follow.
Because he's already defined lower courts.
A Boston University mathematician has set up a website to track how many deaths may result from U.S. aid and Medicaid cuts.
Oh my gosh, Phil, this is getting even worse.
Seriously.
I won't have to do any of these stories next week because I'm getting them all out of the way this week.
Is this like your Lenten thing? You're just going to focus on the negativity until
Brooke Nichols,
Easter?
a Boston University School of Public Health professor, has done the math, set up a website. Because of the PEPFAR funding freeze, that's the AIDS prevention funding, she found that an adult life will be lost every 3 minutes and a child will die every 31 minutes. From cutting USAID's tuberculosis prevention and response program, there will be an additional estimated tuberculosis death every 7 minutes. If the proposed cuts to Medicaid go through, those cuts could lead to an estimated 29,000 excess deaths in the first year. Another one additional death in the U.S. every 18 minutes.
1, 5, 10, 20, even 100 deaths is like horrific and tragic. But when you start talking about thousands and thousands or so many deaths per minute or hour, it just becomes a statistic. And I think it doesn't register to people what's really happening. It's just like when you hear about these deportations that are going on, it was whatever, they're not in my community, or I don't know these people, or it doesn't affect me. But you hear the story of one person who's didn't get due process, who's incorrectly sent to a El Salvadorian maximum security
prison.
Right. And you hear that story and it breaks your heart because you realize how tragic it is. So sometimes you have to personalize these things.
Yeah.
And I'm worried just throwing around these statistics, a lot of people are not, they don't care.
Yeah, well, she's doing this primarily so that representatives in Congress can actually, that are opposing some of these measures, can actually look at this and pull, okay, to date, we estimate this is how many people have died. Are we okay with that?
Okay, but I mean, again, like Cory Booker last week, the Democratic senator from New Jersey, broke the record for the filibuster by speaking for 25 hours straight on the Senate floor.
And he almost died. He almost became a statistic.
And the whole time he was railing against one policy after another from the Trump administration. But the Democrats have no power in Congress. So unless you get Republicans to oppose some of these things, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, right.
And I don't see
they need the stats.
Evidence.
They need the stats.
Yeah, I'm sure they're just sitting waiting for this. If I only had the stats, then I would.
Stats.
I would oppose.
David Brooks wrote a long piece in the Atlantic that we're looking at. It's worth reading. He's been on the show. Episode, search for David Brooks, Holy Post. I don't know the episode number. But he says this. He says, when I joined the conservative movement in the 1980s, there were two types of people: those who cared earnestly about ideas and those who wanted only to shock the left. The reactionary fringe has won. So he's looking at a different way to say, what's happening? What's going on?
Just before we get into this article, I don't think there's been an article that better articulates my feelings about where we are right now than this one.
Okay.
So I highly recommend
it.
Well, did you guys feel that way about this?
Skye says, I felt it articulated your feelings.
Thank you.
Better than any article I'd read.
Same.
I just thought he captured what is going on.
Skye says this article is bonkers.
It's not bonkers. It's the opposite of bonkers. It's the conk bonk.
So it's not a compliment?
I don't know what it is.
Bonkers?
What's bonkers backwards?
Wreck knob. No thanks. All my life, he starts out talking about his journey as a conservative. All my life, I've had a certain idea about America. I've thought of America as a deeply flawed nation that is nonetheless a force for tremendous good in the world. From Abraham Lincoln to FDR to Ronald Reagan and beyond, Americans fought for freedom and human dignity and against tyranny. We promoted democracy, funded the Marshall Plan, saved millions of people across Africa from HIV and AIDS. When we cause harm, like in Vietnam or Iraq, it was because of our overconfidence and naivete, not because of evil intentions. And I think that's a pretty common self-conception.
Yeah.
We are a force for good.
And I think that honestly, that's part of what's behind MAGA. Make America Great Again. It was this sense that in the past, I felt like America was this wonderful shining city on a hill, Kaitlyn's thing, like this magnanimous country that did good in the world. And people got annoyed with progressives and liberals constantly trashing America and making like the 1519 Project, whatever that was. You know, like people didn't like the negativity around America.
Yeah.
And part of the MAGA
but it wasn't
thing was let's talk positively about our country again.
Okay. Yeah. But it's a very different form of positive talk. Since January 20th, that was the inauguration, if you don't remember. As I've watched America behave vilely towards our friends in Canada and Mexico, toward our friends in Europe, toward the heroes in Ukraine and President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office, I've had trouble describing the anguish I've experienced. Maybe the best description for what I'm feeling is moral shame. To watch the loss of your nation's honor is embarrassing and painful. And then he compares Michael Gerson to Russell, and it's
Russell Vought.
I think it's Vought now. I've heard more people say Vought in the last week than say, maybe, I don't know.
Is it Vought or Vought?
I don't know. I'm going to say Vought because I think Ezra Klein was saying Vought, and he seems like he's smart, or at least has fact checkers at the New York Times.
I'm going to look this up. I'm sure there's a definitive answer
somewhere. So Russell Vought, Michael Gerson and Russell Vought are both Wheaton College graduates. So Michael Gerson helped George W. Bush launch PEPFAR, which is estimated to have saved about 25 million lives, people with HIV around the world, and HIV prevention. Russell Vought, Donald Trump's budget director, another Wheaton College grad, has said things like this about federal workers. And this is not like about one specific federal worker. This is about all federal workers.
There's, a handful.
Every one of the millions of people who have opted to be in public service. When they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want to put them in trauma.
Just like Jesus said.
Yeah. Since coming back from the White House, Trump has caused suffering among Ukrainians, suffering among immigrants who've lived here for decades. He said, David Brooks. Yeah. Oh, that is his name. Yeah. I was thinking the Brooks. I always get between David French, the Brooks that makes The Simpsons. What's his name?
I don't know.
Okay. And David Brooks. He says, many of my friends in Washington are evangelical Christians who found their vocation in public service, fighting sex trafficking, serving the world's poor, protecting America from foreign threats, doing biomedical research to cure disease. They are trying to live lives consistent with the gospel of mercy and love. Trump has devastated their work. He isn't just declaring war on quote unquote wokeness. He's declaring war on Christian service. Or any kind of service, really. If there's an underlying philosophy driving Trump, it is this: morality is for suckers. And if there's a consistent strategy, it is this: day after day, the administration works to create a world where ruthless people can thrive. That means destroying any institution or arrangement that might check the strong man's power. The rule of law, domestic and international, restrains power, so it must be eviscerated. Inspectors general, judge advocate general officers, oversight mechanisms, and watchdog agencies are a potential restraint on power, so they must be fired or neutered. The truth itself is a restraint on power, so it must be abandoned. Lying becomes the language of the state. And then he goes back through conservative history and his history with the group of conservatives that were reading books by economists like Milton Friedman, reading books by Edmund Burke. But then there were also a group of reactionaries that just wanted to shock the left. And they were attracted to TV and radio, whereas the other group was attracted to writing in intellectual magazines. And the ones that were attracted to TV and radio and the ones who primarily just wanted to shock the left have won. And he's come to appreciate that they were never conservative. They were anti-establishment, but they were not pro-conservative. And that, if you go back in history, you really see that start with Rush Limbaugh, who was the first one. And the reason it started there was there were changes in radio deregulation that allowed you to do partisan radio broadcasting. Before that, it was illegal. You'd lose your FCC license if you did politically partisan radio broadcasting. And Limbaugh was one of the first ones to jump in and say, let's try this.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
And I'd love to get Kaitlyn's take on this too. I understand that there is a TV, radio kind of dynamic, a media dynamic to this. Without putting, I don't want to say Rush Limbaugh isn't to blame for anything, but I think part of the blame should be laid at the feet of the audience. Because these programs, this is true of cable news as well, ultimately they rise or fall on their viewership. They're trying to attract as large an audience as possible. Hold on. And when you're trying to attract a super large audience, we know that more people are drawn by fear and anger than they are by thoughtfulness and nuance.
So you're just going to be mad at human nature?
No, I'm saying when your political discourse is market driven and the market loves anger and fear, that's what you're going to get more and more and more of. There's a reason why when you go and watch a news program on PBS, it has a very different tone than when you watch it on one of the other cable networks.
Or BBC.
Or BBC, exactly. Because they're not market driven and therefore they're not feeding the base motivations of people.
Capitalism is the problem.
It is in this regard. Yes, when it's unchecked and it's decoupled from virtue, this is what you get. Am I wrong, Kaitlyn?
No, I mean, I think you're making a point people have made for a long time about, the medium is the message.
Right.
Like the way in which we receive political information shapes the kind of information we want and the kind of information that gets people's attention. The other thing, though, that I think is really important about this piece is two things. One, he clarifies that what actually is happening at the level of media and political power is two groups of elites on the progressive end and the conservative end, fighting, both claiming to care for vulnerable people and both often discarding them when it doesn't fit their ideological preferences. And I appreciate his willingness to say a lot of this ideological fight, a lot of the I'm not actually conservative, I'm just anti-left, exists on the other side and is mostly the chattering class. It's not the people who are it is the people who are consuming the media, like you're talking about, Skye. We forget that a huge percentage of people voting for presidential candidates are not people paying attention to any of that media.
Right.
They might pay attention to some of the the news. They might watch some Fox News or they might watch some CNN, but they're not paying attention to all the op-eds, all the Twitter, all the radio. A lot of them are making political judgments without all of that information. And then we are making our judgments about them and their political decisions based on information they don't even have or they're not paying attention to.
Do you know how popular Rush Limbaugh's radio show was? Kaitlyn Chess?
Oh, it's a lot of people, for sure.
But there are also a lot of people. Tens of millions.
It is also a lot of people that are not paying attention to any of that.
Yeah.
But
they're on Facebook.
Who are captive to some of those things, but don't know what else is out there. But the other thing that I think is really important, the end of his article is surprisingly hopeful in that he's people are mobilizing, people are having conversations. But I think the thing that's really important is across the piece, he's talking about nihilism and how nihilism and power together create these really toxic dynamics. And what I'm worried about is people will read most of the article and actually become sort of nihilistic the way he's claiming Trumpism is, because so much of the article is look at how awful all of this is, and miss that you can replicate the same exact dynamics from a different political perspective if all you're focusing on is everything horrible. And he's not just hopeful in the end, maybe we'll get some things together and try and have a good conversation. He also is saying at some point, Trump will make mistakes. At some point, there will be failures. And if he doesn't say this explicitly, this is me now, but if we have not cultivated the posture, the spiritual formation, the fortitude against all of the temptations toward nihilism to create something good in the aftermath, we'll just create something bad. There's such great potential here for us to be so hardened and twisted by all of this that he still wins in the end, even if he doesn't win politically in the end.
Okay. less than halfway through the article, because it does sound, from what we've said so far, like it's a downer of an article. It is not.
That's why I like this article so much.
Yeah.
Less than halfway through the article, he says, how does this end? And then he completely changes to talk about other events in American history that have been similar, particularly the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and how he was probably the most Trumpian, nihilistic president that we had before Trump, and that the response to him was the creation of the Whigs Party, which was responsible for a great reformation of American systems and building of new institutions to help the common man and to hold up human dignity, so that the response to Jackson was more lasting than Jackson. And then he goes on to say, and I think this is my favorite part. Oh, here we go. He says, we've reached a point of traumatic rupture. A demagogue has come to power and is ripping everything down. But what's likely to happen is that the demagogue will start making mistakes because incompetence is built into the nihilistic project. Nihilists can only destroy, not build. Authoritarian nihilism is inherently stupid. I don't mean that Trumpists have low IQs. I mean they do things that run directly against their own interests. They are pathologically self-destructive. When you create an administration in which one man has all the power and everybody else has to flatter his voracious ego, stupidity results. Authoritarians are also morally stupid. Humility, prudence, and honesty are not just nice virtues to have, they're practical tools that produce good outcomes. When you replace them with greed, lust, hypocrisy, and dishonesty, terrible things happen. So his conclusion is, terrible things are going to happen, which will not be pleasant for anyone. People will get hurt, but it will also probably mark the beginning of the end of this particularly, populist and nihilistic moment.
I really hope so. But I'm not convinced.
No, you're not convinced.
I'm not convinced. I mean, I think it would be fantastic to see a new kind of Whig movement that is virtuous and moral and constitutional and seeks the common good. And for those who don't know their history, the Whig Party kind of morphed eventually into the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And so that's that era. But I think there are some... I appreciate him making parallels to 19th century America, to Jacksonian America, to the Whig Party, but there are certain conditions which are fundamentally different in the 21st century that are unprecedented, that we can't know if they will go the same direction.
Skye, are you going to make the positive story less hopeful?
No, I hope
Classic.
I hope he's right. I just think there's a fundamental missing piece here, which and I think he maybe talks about this a little bit. Kaitlyn, you're like ready to go. What am I?
You talk about the fundamental missing piece you think's there, and then I'll talk about the one I think's there.
Okay.
I think one of the fundamental missing pieces here is digital media.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yes. Well, why is that bad?
You're right. You're
okay.
right. No,
I'm just,
you're totally
like,
right.
There were, obviously it was newspapers primarily in the 19th century. It was before radio. It was before any of that. And there was a fragmentation of American media, but there were fewer fragmentations. And with algorithms and digital media, it's just exponentially worse. And it makes it that much harder to try to unify a country after a rupture like what we might be going through. So I hope the pattern holds that he's describing. I think there are variables that we don't know what effect they may have, and can the rupture be mended the way it was almost 200 years ago or not? So, Kaitlyn, what was the piece you think is missing here?
The return of Jesus Christ to make all things new. Okay, listen though, I'm serious. But here's what I think is actually really cool about reading this piece in anticipation of Easter, truly. There is this movement he's making in a very earthly political sense of like, hey, things look so bad. But inside this really bad thing, are there actually these seeds of something positive that could come out of it? And we're about to spend all of Holy Week and then many weeks of Easter, but especially Holy Week, just thinking about the fact that from the perspective of humans at the time, this is the greatest defeat of what Jesus was trying to do. He is humiliated, he is killed, and his movement is over. And then what's actually happening behind the scenes is the resurrection. I mean, not only is the resurrection coming, but happening behind the scenes in the death, in the crucifixion of Christ, is the redemption of all things. I mean, not to like get on my harrowing of hell soapbox, but like he is literally pulling God's people out of the realm of the dead and proclaiming his victory over sin and death to demons in hell.
Maybe that mega prison in El Salvador is a metaphor for the harrowing of hell.
Listen.
And we're going to go down and pull them back out. And people are going to be inspired when they see the metaphor writ large. And then, so what you're saying is, the good news is that's missing here, Jesus. The bad news that's missing here, smartphones. So it's Jesus versus the smartphones.
Well,
who can win?
But here's the thing. Here's the other part of this that is important. Our friend Malcolm Foley, who just did a Holy Post Live event with us, who's been on the show, who's been on like all of the shows, he was telling me recently about a sermon he was giving on the book of Revelation at his church in Waco. And he said one of the messages of the book of Revelation is not what you might think would comfort Christians in the midst of persecution and violence and injustice and evil. You might think the word that God would give to those Christians is things are not that bad. The word that God actually gives to those Christians are things are actually so much worse than you think they are. And I actually think something similar needs to be said to us today when we're looking at this long list of everything horrible going on. I'm not talking about the resurrection of Christ to be like, things aren't actually that bad. Actually, the death and resurrection of Christ that we are going to remember in our bodies and communally in Holy Week and then for many weeks of Easter is that actually, even though things seem really horrific and violent and unjust and evil right now, the truth is it's actually even worse than that. Like things actually are really worse than you think they are. And that is why such a extreme response from God was necessary. And thank God that he did it. And that we have hope to address these political evils, not to withdraw from political questions or to pat ourselves in the back and say, okay, well, everything's fine. I don't have to worry about the injustice that's happening, but to say I'm actually deeply motivated to care about these things because I know the end of the story is justice and reconciliation and redemption. And so I can work towards that end without feeling like I just have to be hopeless about everything horrible that's happening, which is mostly what I'm actually seeing on the left right now. I'm in a really progressive city in a school that has a lot of progressive activist type students. Most of them, when they hear this long list of awful things, are not inspired to do more. They're exhausted, they're overwhelmed, and they feel like there's nothing possibly good that can happen. So the death and resurrection of Christ should not be like a pious whitewashing of everything that's happening. Oh, it's fine, Jesus is coming back, everything's good. It actually should be, if the alternative is hopelessness, if the alternative is everything will just continue to get worse and there's nothing we can do, that doesn't actually spark the kind of political activity that you think is necessary. Actually, in most of Christian history, it's been a return to remembering the resurrection of Christ and the resurrection of our bodies that we are promised that's actually provoked great movement towards political justice.
Okay. Awesome. So what do you need to do? We got to wrap it up. We're out of time. What do you need to do? You can be aware of what's going on. It's okay to be aware of what's going on. Let's know. Let's not be hopeless. Let's not be nihilistic. Let's not say, oh, you're burning down the things that we think society needs, so we're going to burn down the things you think society needs. No.
Yeah.
No, let's not do that. But read this article and see if the second half gives you hope, even though the first half is a little discouraging. And keep advocating and be aware of some of these stories. So if you have a friend you bump into, a friend that you know well, who says, isn't it great, all the things that President Trump is doing? Isn't this God's will for America? Just say, well, here, you know what else is happening? I might give you another insight on that. Okay, and finally, do you live in or around the Detroit area? That's in Michigan, where the economy may soon be suffering because of auto tariffs. We're coming your way on May 3rd for the next Evening with the Holy Post. Tim Alberta will be joining Skye Jitani for a great conversation and a Q&A with the audience. You can buy your tickets now at holypost.com/events. In the words of Skye Jitani, it's going to be bonkers.
I hope not.
I think that's a good thing. I like bonkers.
Okay.
And we'll see you next time.
This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode. This episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. Hey, if you're like me, you want to use your money to do good in the world, to support causes you really believe in. But by the end of the month, your money's all gone. Maybe it's because, like me, you've got like 50 subscriptions, half of which you don't even remember signing up for. That app for your kids that they used like once, that delivery service, the fitness plan that didn't work out so well. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills and free up money for the things you really care about. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has helped save its members an average of $740 a year with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. I can see all my subscriptions in one place, and Rocket Money will help me cancel the ones I'm not using with just a few taps. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/holypost. That's rocketmoney.com/holypost. rocketmoney.com/holypost. And thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this episode.
Since 2016, we've had many guests on this show to talk about what on earth is happening to the American church, and especially American evangelicalism. We've had historians, theologians, journalists, and sociologists, but all of them have had something in common. They've all been Christians. They've all been inside the Christian camp trying to describe what's happening to it and how to fix it. But my guest today is different. Jonathan Rauch is a journalist and lifelong atheist, but he's also deeply concerned about the evangelical movement in America. His new book is Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. This book is not an outsider throwing stones at the church. In fact, as you'll hear in our conversation, sometimes I think Rauch goes a little too easy on the church. Instead, the book examines the shortcomings of secularism and why our constitutional system of government needs a church that takes following Jesus seriously. Jonathan Rauch is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. We also have a bonus interview with Jonathan Rauch today exclusively for Holy Post Plus subscribers. If you want to get that and you're not yet a subscriber, head over to holypost.com and join the Holy Post media community today. Here's my conversation with Jonathan Rauch. Jonathan Rauch, welcome to the Holy Post.
I'm happy to be here. Delighted, in fact.
Delighted you're here. As we were talking before recording, we met many years ago at an off-the-record meeting of LGBT activists and conservative Christian activists around this issue of civil liberties. And it was before Obergefell, and it was a fascinating gathering. And I'm
2011.
Yeah, it's been a while. So I regret losing track of you, but you've been doing a lot of fantastic work. Your latest book is Cross Purposes: Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. In some ways, you're a fairly surprising messenger for this content, but
you're putting that charitably, Skye.
Well, but in some ways, you're a perfect messenger. It's a little bit, only Nixon could go to China. So you are Jewish by background. You're an atheist. You are gay. And yet you've written a book about the role of Christianity in our public lives. You admit in the book that your view of religion and your view of Christianity and its role in society has changed since the time you were a young man. What changed and why?
You mean apart from everything? So a bit of background. I was born in 1960 in Phoenix, Arizona. 3 things I realized about myself quite young. One was an intense attraction to boys and men of a kind that I then did not understand, but later realized. Second is that I could not believe in God. I tried at one point, but it just didn't make sense to me. And a third is that I'm Jewish, and you can be Jewish and get away with not believing in God if you don't make too big a fuss about it. And those things put me very much on the outs with the surrounding Christian culture. I grew up with a very bad attitude toward Christianity. I thought it was cruel and bigoted and hypocritical. And in those years, I was not wrong. to unfortunately, too much of an extent today, I'm still not wrong. I met my first real Christian, someone who walked the walk, as a college freshman, Mark McIntosh. He later went on to become a very distinguished Episcopal priest and seminary professor and author. But that was eye-opening because he didn't just use Christianity as a weapon to be better than me. He infused his life with Christian values. Like, he was salty and had a sense of humor and got angry. So obviously, human. But that was the first time that I realized maybe there's something to this Christianity thing that isn't just what I've been seeing in its public face. And so that led me on a journey. I'm still atheist, but not militant about it. But in 2003, I wrote what is officially the dumbest thing I've ever written. And that includes my confident prediction in the Atlantic in 2015 that Donald Trump would never be president. But in 2003, I wrote a piece celebrating secularization, saying, isn't it great that people are just losing interest in religion in America? And we'll all be better off without it, because we all know religion is a force for divisiveness in society and dogmatism. And this is great. I call it a major civilizational advance. And I was just completely, totally, utterly wrong about that. We've seen a catastrophic decline in Christianity. It's been a number of decades, but the last 15 to 20 years have been unprecedented in the de-churching that we've seen. And all the social indicators and political indicators about American life are going the wrong way. And those things are not coincidental.
So you mentioned your friendship with Mark McIntosh, and the book is beautifully bookended with that relationship in a very touching way. But your relationship with him also exemplifies what you're advocating for in this book, which is you and Mark fundamentally disagree on a number of things, and yet respect each other and have an admiration for one another in a way that makes it possible for a diverse, pluralistic society to thrive. And those qualities seem to be diminishing. You talk about throughout the book that democracy needs faith, that it can't survive, especially a pluralistic democracy like ours cannot survive if faith, and specifically if Christianity in the United States, continues to deteriorate. Why?
Well, that puts it a bit strongly. The title of the book, though, is Cross Purposes. I don't know that it's impossible for America to be America if it continues the course of secularization we're seeing. I just think that everything else gets harder. What I mean by cross purposes is if America's predominant faith, which is white Protestantism, is not aligned with the core values of our Constitution and liberal democracy, but instead, if they're pulling against each other, the country pulls itself apart. This is a book, we talk about faith and religion, but this is actually a book about Christianity, and it's addressed to Christians. It's about you. It's kind of a letter from me as an outsider to you and the importance of your gospel and your teachings in our democracy right now, and the catastrophic mistake that I think, and many Christians think, that white evangelicals specifically have made. But the core idea there is that the founders told us that they could give us a constitution and a structure for self-government, but they could not govern our souls. And they told us that we would have to bring the values that support democracy from outside the Constitution. They called it Republican virtue. And they meant things like honesty, civility, respect for others, being a well-informed citizen, being truthful, things like that. You can't have a democracy without those things. And the place they told us to go and get those values was civil society, which meant family, of course, and schools and community. But it meant, very emphatically, Christianity. White Protestantism, specifically. That's the country's founding faith. So they were they were counting on Christianity to do this job of socializing ourselves in these virtues. And it did for a long time. It made terrible, terrible mistakes. You know, the Southern Baptists and slavery, the attack on homosexuals, all of that stuff. It's true. But when I was growing up, Skye, you might be a bit young for this, I don't know. But in the 60s and 70s, the first thing people would ask each other often in conversation wasn't, where are you from, or what's your job, or where'd you go to college? It's, what church do you belong to? Because right through the 20th century, 70% of Americans belong to a church. That collapsed in the 21st century. It's now under half and falling. And those people are becoming nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who are not affiliated with a religion. So it turns out Christianity is a load-bearing wall in our democracy because it's doing some things that secular culture can't. It's answering the question of, why am I here? Does my life have a purpose? Am I more than a random agglomeration of molecules that exists very briefly? And it's answering the question about, where does morality come from? The difference between right and wrong, is that grounded in something larger than human preferences? I'm secular and I can't answer those questions. So we need that source of values. It's more than just, a relationship of convenience. Christianity and democracy in America need each other.
Okay, I mean, there's a lot there. I concur with what you're saying. One piece of it is folks like Andrew Sullivan and others have talked about a conservation of religious energy, whereas engagement in formal religion is declining in America, the impulse, the need for those moral foundations and sense of purpose has to get expressed somewhere. And an argument's been made as it's being expressed less and less in formal religion, it's finding expression in our politics, which leads to the kind of intransigence and divisiveness that we're seeing in our political realm. But the other piece, I mean, what you just said there about the founders and their understanding of the limits of the Constitution and the need to gain virtue from these outside civic sources, including or especially Christianity, there are Christian nationalists out there and some pseudo historians like David Barton and others who would agree with you, but they would push it to the extreme and say, you can only have this country if a majority or a supermajority of its population are committed Protestant Christians. And that fuels some of their argument in the culture war that we ought to marginalize or in some way strip rights away from people who are gay or secular or non-Christian in their beliefs. What do you say to those folks who are using the founders and their vision of this country as an excuse for actually taking rights away from fellow citizens rather than empowering them?
Well, so there's a big problem with Christian nationalism as it enters this conversation, and that's that it's not Christian. All the scholars, you probably had some on your show who have looked at Christian nationalism in the U.S. and Europe, have concluded that it appropriates symbols of Christianity, but it is a secular movement about power and about bringing power to a specific group of people. That is not what Christianity is about. So the founders, I think, were not saying, we know this, we're not saying you have to be a Christian to be good Americans, or this is a Christian nation. And in fact, there's a whole book about this. It's called American Heretics by Jerome Kopolsky. You should have him on. Christian nationalism is not new. It existed in the era of the founders. And there was a lot of pressure that they put on the founders to explicitly mention Christ and Christianity in the founding documents.
Yeah, I've done an explainer video about how secular the problem in getting the Constitution ratified was its secularity. People did not like the fact that it didn't speak of God.
Exactly. And it didn't specifically speak of Jesus Christ. And that was a controversial decision at the time. And they made that because they understood this is a pluralistic country. Right. It has many traditions and many faiths, and we've got to create a situation where they can all express themselves. So the values that the founders were counting on Christianity to bring are not the values of Christian nationalism, because those are illiberal values. They claim to be Christian, but they're about one group gets to dominate and the rest of people can go pound sand.
Right.
That's the opposite of the values that the founders were counting on Christianity to bring, which have more to do with the actual teachings of Jesus, which involve defending the least of these, egalitarian. Everyone gets to be treated equally. It's there in the Declaration, right? All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Forgiveness, core Christian virtue. They assumed, you're going to have to live with each other. If you win an election, you can't try to drive the other side out of the country and salt the soil with the tears of their women and children. You got to share the country. Don't be afraid. Core Christian value, also core to liberal democracy. Sometimes you lose an election. It's not the end of the world. Demagogues are going to try to stir you up with fear to give them power. Don't go around with fear as the sort of governing emotion. That's not compatible with a liberal democracy. And it's also the most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible. So what they were saying is those are the values we need you to bring, not whatever value it is that, Christian nationalists want to bring, which are illiberal and inconsistent with the Constitution.
So one of the major sections of the book is titled Thin Christianity. And I want to get into what you mean by that. But it involves diagnosing the real problem that we're experiencing. Everyone agrees religious adherence is declining in the United States. You've talked about the nuns, the declining number of people who are committed to a church. We could get into more qualitative decline as well. But the question is who's responsible for that? Why is it happening? One group of prominent folks who identify as post-liberal are arguing that it's liberal democracy itself that has undermined the church. Folks like Sohab Amari, Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, others who say the liberal experiment that the founders inaugurated in this country over the past few centuries has slowly eroded the foundations that make Christianity viable within a society. And so they argue democracy has failed, liberalism has failed, and it's okay then in the name of Christ to remove those systems in order to return to, I don't know what exactly they're advocating for because it seems kind of muddled, monarchy, theocracy, something like that.
They won't tell us what they actually want.
Right. But the argument is I can understand why it's so appealing to some Christians, because it makes the boogeyman out there. It's the secularists who are out to get us. It's capitalism. It's the breakdown of the family that's being driven by Hollywood and, all the alphabet people and things like that. Like that becomes the boogeyman. You make a pretty compelling case that their critique is wrong. And I know it's unfair to ask you to do this in the brief time we have, but can you give a synopsis of why you think that argument doesn't hold up to the evidence?
I will try. And if I start to ramble, you will cut me off.
I will.
But there's a couple ideas to try to wedge into this. The first is that those folks are not entirely wrong. It is unquestionably challenging to be a Christian or a person of faith in today's modern secular world. Everything from cell phones to online pornography to what if your kid comes home from school announcing that they've changed sex, and everything in between. However, it has always been challenging to be a person of a radically countercultural faith in America, and Christianity is a radically countercultural faith. And if you don't believe me, ask Jesus, who was executed for his radically countercultural faith. Christianity is at its strongest, not its weakest. When it is an exilic religion, as the theologian Mark Labberton has put it, when it is not trying to dominate society, when it is challenging society from the outside and being countercultural. So it is not the case that it's supposed to be easy to be a Christian now or any time in the past. That's number one. The challenges are real, yes, but they are hardly new. The second thing, so there's a bit of a blame game going on, and those post-liberals are saying, I'm at fault for Christianity's decline because I haven't made it easy enough for them. And that's inherently the case in liberalism. It's a critique that goes back to Nietzsche in the 19th century, who said basically that secular society is undermining the foundations of religion, and that's going to cause a crisis, and it did. So, okay, there's some truth in that. I cop to that in the book. This book is framed as an apology to Christians from a secular liberal who I believe that we have neglected at best and often been actively hostile to Christianity in modern secular culture. And I can go into the ways that we have been, and we need to do better. And we can talk about what those ways are and how to do better. But they're right about that. However, big however, are people fleeing the church in record numbers in the last 20 years because of something liberals have done? Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton? Or is it because the message of the church is no longer resonating with those millions and millions of Americans? 40 million Americans, more than were brought into the church during all three Great Awakenings, have exited the church in about the last 15 years. I mean, this is shocking. I don't think I did that. I think this is mainly the result of some tragic choices that Christians have made in modern American life. The first was the waves of secularization in the mainline church back in the last century, which kind of drifted into a kind of all-purpose, kind of watered down progressive leftism and lost its cultural distinctiveness. And people thought, well, if I'm going to, just kind of be an all-purpose do-gooder, I can do that without giving up my Sundays. And then the second wave of secularization, I think more damaging than the first, is in the white evangelical church. Begins in the 80s and 90s with Falwell and Robertson, but really takes off in this century when the church becomes essentially joined at the hip with the Republican Party. It becomes partisan. It then becomes the core foundation of the MAGA movement. It brings that to the church. The church becomes politicized. People who are there for spiritual values begin to drift away because, again, you don't need to give up a Sunday if that's what you want to do. Young people especially see hypocrisy in the church. They see, wait a minute, Jesus is preaching one kind of thing, and yet we're 80+% for the least Christ-like figure in American history. Hypocrisy is hard to sustain in a faith tradition. People see that. And so the white evangelical church begins to shrink rapidly. There's now, according to Pew, there's no more white evangelicals in America than there are white mainliners in America. And where are those people going? It turns out they're becoming mostly nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people without any religious affiliation. I did not make the church embrace partisan politics. I did not make it bring in the culture wars as the core of its message. Those are choices the church made, and they're not working for the church or for democracy. Sorry, I went on.
No, that's great. I think this is the part of your book I struggled with the most. Not because I disagree. I'm just not sure it's a full enough explanation. No doubt, the religious right, the politicization of the church, its coziness with the Republican Party, all that stuff is deeply problematic. And in the last 10 years, in the Trump era, it has definitely accelerated and gotten way, way worse. However, back in the 90s, I went to an evangelical seminary. I became a pastor at a church here in Wheaton. I, through my time at Christianity Today, traveled all over the country, engaged with all kinds of different Christian leaders and churches and environments for the last 20 years. And I can say with confidence, in all those years and all those environments, I never heard a single sermon, message, conference that in any way was partisan or political. And yet I know that there was this undercurrent of politics in a lot of white evangelicalism. So I'm not sure it's a complete enough explanation to say the church kind of sold itself to political activism and abandoned its core message or the gospel for that. It is certainly part of the explanation, but I don't think it explains all of it. And so that's the piece that I'm not searching for it, but I'm looking for more people to articulate it. You at one point use this phrase, which I thought was super helpful. You speak about a cultural trade deficit. Unpack what that means for a minute, because I think there you have the seeds of a deeper explanation of what's going on here that is beyond just the political. What do you mean by cultural trade deficit in the church?
I'd love to answer that. Is there time for me just to comment on what you just said?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because it's kind of important. So we know something is happening, and something else we know is pastors are unhappy about it.
Right.
A couple of years ago, Barna did a survey. 42% of American pastors said that they had seriously considered quitting in the last year. And the number 3 reason, the first 2 were like, I don't remember, but it's like, doesn't pay well in high stress. But number 3 was politics. What's happening is not driven from the top down by pastors who want to preach about politics. It's the opposite of what they want. They hate it.
Right.
They're there for Jesus. They're trying to keep it out of the church. It's people bringing the culture wars and the mindset of the culture wars to church. It's that minority, but vocal minority of the church that bombards the pastor on Monday morning with, why are you being such a squish when we've got this fight to save our country? It's pressure that's from the bottom up that's bringing these outside forces in, and that's changing the complexion of the church and who's going to church. And it's an influx of people into the white evangelical church who in some cases are not even church attendees. They're actually people who are there because it's part of a political package.
Right.
So it's changing who's in the church. People of a certain kind are leaving and people of another kind are coming. It's much more bottom up. That, I think, is part of the explanation. That gets to your point about...
Yes, I 100% agree with that. But I think the difference is, and maybe this is where I depart from other observers, I don't think this is anything new. I think American evangelicalism has always been inherently market-driven. It is a capitalistic form of Christianity that responds to what the people want. It has built itself on reaching as many people as possible, growing and planting as many churches as possible. And in that kind of consumeristic, market-driven form of faith, the customer is king. And you give the people what they want. It just so happens that in the last few decades, what the people want is either a highly politicized gospel or at least church leaders who won't attack their idolatry of partisan politics when they come to church. And so
that seems right.
And I think you mentioned earlier that I think you quoted a pastor who was talking, or maybe John Ward, our mutual connection, who talked in the book about how the church has generally done a pretty good job at instilling personal virtue in people's private lives, but has not talked or given a vision for civic virtue of what their public lives should look like as a follower of Jesus. I agree with that entirely, but that's not a new problem either. I mean, that goes back to the antebellum South, where a form of Christianity developed in the South that said private virtue was good, but we're not going to talk about the civic or communal implications of this faith because that would undermine our commitment to slavery. And that form of Southern Christianity, it feels like, has just taken over most of evangelicalism in America, where private things are okay, public things, well, that's political. We're not going to talk about that. And too many pastors, I think, have just acquiesced to that bias and doesn't touch the idolatry of politics in their people, continues to respond to what the market wants. And it just so happens it's become really toxic to a pluralistic democratic society when what the people want is authoritarianism, Christian nationalism, partisanship, bigotry, and non-cooperation with non-Christian neighbors. That's now what they've been formed with through Fox News and all these other media. And the church is impotent in dealing with it because it doesn't have the tools. It never had the tools, even if you go back, to deal with that because it was a market-driven model rather than a spiritual formation model.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's true that it's always been a market-driven model. I think, but I'd have to think about that. When I look back on the mainline churches of my youth and think about all the many channels that it used to go about the work of socializing people.
I don't think the mainline was market-driven. I think evangelicalism was largely market-driven.
Wow, that's interesting. So that's a bit of a condemnation, I guess, in one sense.
It is, and I think it worked really well when what the market wanted was more or less in conformity with what the church wanted to provide.
Yeah, that's where I was about to go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, when you have a political environment which is not super radicalized and not super polarized, and when Congress is functioning pretty well as it did in the 70s and 80s when I was coming up, it really actually worked.
Mm-hmm.
And you had pretty broad consensus on some important things like the culture war. Of course, there were sharp disputes about other things like civil rights and gay rights and whatnot. But we had a sense that we were, as a country, capable of working through those things. Then you're right, there wasn't the same kind of pressure on the church to bring these radical social and political divisions into the church. And I think the process, you're right, I think we're agreeing, is we talked about cultural trade deficit. That's when the church imports more from the surrounding culture than it exports in terms of its Christian values. When those outside values become more and more partisan and hyper politicized and angry and fearful, and that begins to come into the church and change the church. So it sounds like we're in more or less alignment about that aspect of the story. The question is it really true that there was just never more than a market to the church? I mean, doesn't the gospel of Jesus, isn't that in some sense a theological anchor that at least has been present to some extent and that does have certain implications from our civic life?
Yes, I agree. One of the metaphors that I heard someone else use that I think gets at your cultural deficit idea is the church is called to be a thermostat that sets the temperature, but it's become a thermometer and just reacts to the temperature. I think, like, when I was a kid in the part of the dynamic that I think gets overlooked here is when it was functioning, when you think back to the 70s, maybe even the 80s, I think one of the reasons it was functioning was because the Cold War was centered to a lot of this, that white evangelicalism postured itself since the 1950s under Eisenhower as an antidote to the communists, to those terrible atheist socialists out there that are out to destroy America in the Christian way and all that. And as long as they had that foil, they could cooperate with their fellow Americans against that shared enemy, even if that fellow American was Jewish or atheist or Muslim. We're capitalists, we're Americans, we believe the communists are the bad guys. With the fall of communism in the early 90s, I think both the Republican Party and the evangelical movement had a bit of a crisis in figuring out, well, who's the big bad guy now? And the big bad guy ended up becoming our fellow citizens. It became Democrats, it became the liberal secularists. And it shifted the guns from pointing at the Soviet Union and the communists to our fellow citizens. But it always had this posture of who's the bad guy that we're afraid of? And then what are we called upon to do to protect ourselves from that fear? And in the 80s and 70s, whatever, it meant being a better American was the way to combat communism. But now it means if the other Americans, if my neighbors are the bad guys, it requires a completely different set of values for me to fight the people who could win the election this year or could take over Congress or could get the White House. I think that's part of what shifted here. And in that earlier iteration, I'm not saying the gospel didn't have a role in it. It was just easier to convince people that the way of Jesus was the way of virtue. Whereas now, and you've cited it many times in your book, Russell Moore has said he's been at places and he's quoted the Sermon on the Mount, and people confront him asking him where he got those liberal talking points. So that's what's changed. Is it used to be being a good American and being a good Christian were not in conflict with each other. And now increasingly they are. At least that's the perception of some people in the Christian nationalist far right point of view. But like I said, I think your book gets it. I almost wish the book was twice as long, but
yeah, I had a word limit. Yeah, I want to agree with what you're saying, and I want to throw in media change. You know, you've got the whole conservative media system, which is ecosystem, which is very influential in white Protestantism. But I just still want to insist, just for 1 minute more, on whether there hasn't independently, or at least related to, but not the same as those outside variables. A church is more than just a bunch of demographic and cultural and economic influences. It is a teaching. It is a body of beliefs. And there are things that Jesus said and was pretty clear about. And I think we touched on them, but they include, don't be afraid, number one. They include, be like Jesus, imitate him, and they include forgive each other. And those three pillars of the church are things which we have seen in their civic behavior white evangelicals move away from. We can talk until the cows come home about why they've moved away from it and what the influences are that cause that. But the point is that there seems to have been a corruption of the church itself in terms of its teaching, in terms of the way people are viewing those things. When a politician stands up and says, I am your retribution, he's not talking about forgive each other. He's talking about something very un-Christ-like. When he refers to an entire group of Americans as vermin, or people, humans, as vermin, that is not imitating Jesus. When he says, you're under threat and only I can save you, that is not, don't be afraid. And when the church ingests and embraces those things, there's a corruption of its theology, right?
100%. We're almost out of time on this. We're going to keep recording for Holy Post Plus, folks. But I hope people appreciate the irony of this conversation, where the atheist is arguing for Christian doctrine and an explanation for the abandonment of those things in the church. And the former pastor and Christian author is the one giving market explanations and secular arguments for what's happened. But this is where I 100% agree with you. Yes, we talk about this ad nauseum on the Holy Post, and we've had tons of guests on here to talk about this from different angles. It is a failure of the church to follow Jesus that has opened the way for many people who identify as Christians to pursue decidedly unchristian ideas and values in their posture towards their neighbors. And that's tragic. I want to talk about what you prescribe as at least partially a solution to this. Spoiler alert, you're basically calling Christians to follow Jesus, which is wonderful. But you have a whole section in here about your experience and interviews with leaders in the Church of Latter-day Saints and their willingness to compromise with gay rights activists in Utah and then nationwide. And I think there's a lot to learn there. We're going to talk about that in a bonus segment for Holy Post Plus. But everyone, I cannot recommend Jonathan Rauch's book enough. It's called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. And Jonathan, thank you for writing this, and to the audience that I think is going to be more receptive to hearing it from you than from coming from me or someone from within our Holy Post kind of audience, because I just think you have so much credibility here as somebody who unfortunately has been hurt and wounded by Christians in the past. And yet you've seen through those errors at the benefit that this faith does bring to our culture.
And the need for the core tenets of this faith.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the last book I ever thought I'd write, coming from where I'm coming from. But Skye, it turns out that you don't have to believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ to believe that he got some very, very important things right, and that America needs those things right now.
Well, amen. Thanks for that. And I will post a link to the book in the show notes and look forward to interacting with folks in the comment section about this. But Jonathan's going to stick around for a bonus segment where we talk about what the Mormons have that maybe evangelicals can learn from. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.